Well, I think almost everything I wanted to say has already been said. But I will just start with one disclaimer that many of you are not from North India or Hindi speaking region. So there might be certain restlessness within yourself as to why we are reading a book which is about Agge. But I would also like to say with, uh, that Agge is not just North India. His life journey took him to many different parts of the country, and therefore some of the reflections I think that Mukul has given us in this beautiful book show that he cannot be identified with regional identities of one state or so and so forth. And second, which I think makes me really happy, and Suki has already said it, uh, is that we hardly read biographies or autobiographies in social sciences. Historians do to some extent, but political science probably discipline doesn't take into account the biographies and autobiographies that seriously. And I think doing this discussion on this book is actually very important because I think we must look at this genre of writing. I would also like to say just one more thing that the word Hindi or Hindi language has been unambiguously been identified with Hindu nationalism, Hindutva nationalism, Hindu nationalism of the Hindutva kind. And when you read a writer like Agge and many others of that time, you will see there is no such unproblematic motivation. So reading Agge actually is a critical task, a social task that I think we can all take in. And I really would urge all of you to read with one caveat to the author that you should try to get a student edition on a reduced price. It's 1,000 rupees and maybe paperback. But it's a book which I would recommend my students to read because it's not just about a gay, about a person, a writer, a poet, a journalist, a traveler, a rebel, a lover. It's revolutionary, but also actually it is a text about the um, social life of many individuals and how do we look at the context and how beautifully Mukul has produced a social text of the 20th century India of the first 77 decades of his life actually interwoven with all the major social, cultural, political developments that are happening before independence, after independence. It's a Nehruvian India, it's a Gandhian India, it's post-Nehruvian India. So all the institutions that were set up by Nehru, whether political, cultural, there's far too many. And if you look at the way in which institutions were set up, you see there is a certain kind of a contextual institutionalism that is emerging. And people like Rahul Sanskritan and Agge and Matthew Sharan Gupta, and you name them, they are actually brought into these cultural institutions, Sahitya Academy, literary bodies, because Nehru himself was a great, was a writer, was a philosopher. So I think we have to therefore place Agge in that kind of a social context to make sense of this admiringly beautiful, epic, I would say, a biography, or epochal biography. You don't get to see, as you said, Trisha, you don't get to see biographies of this kind. I mean, I've not seen such a big fat biography, but also biography which actually you cannot put down once you start reading. So we didn't give me many days, but once I bought it, I just could not put it down. So I think it's therefore important because when I was growing up in the school and college, we had some section of Sachidanand Hiranand Vatsya and Agge. I used to wonder, such a long name, isn't it enough just to have Sachidanand, Hiranand, Vatsya, and then Agge? And I had an answer in your book that Premchand gave him that name, and so appropriate for the time to give that name because it was difficult to write under your own name. These were the time of the British rule, sedition rule was around, and you were, participating in anti-colonial activities. That reminds me that if you read many of the Hindi periodicals of that time, there were women who began to write, and I'm sure Mukul has seen those. They were writing M, N, P, not even full name. because the patriarchy didn't tolerate it. So I think the book takes us so beautifully into the different terrains of the life of the ordinary and extraordinary, not just of a gay, but of many others who were part of his comradeship, who were actually normal people. And I agree with Poonam that we should, or I think Trisha also made that point, that writers, or that matter, are normal human beings. We tend to elevate them, and you probably do that with some other heroes of your life in your mind sometimes. But when you see they are living like us, I think that sort of takes away the myth about them. So how do I, what do I want to say about the book? A lot, much has been said, but nevertheless, let me say a few things. I think Mukul has done commendable job of writing an epochal biography, I would say, of a giant Hindi literary writer, no doubt about it, with every little minute details of it. And I was really, and this is what we tell our students, you should read not just the text, but the counter text of the text, which is in the footnote, and in your case, in the end note. I was actually intrigued. The acknowledgements are at the very end. They generally are in the beginning. So I'm going to ask you, why did you do that? Okay. I thought there is some other reason. Okay. But the footnotes of 200 pages, references going into 200 pages require to pay attention, and I think that itself is a remarkable thing to do. Mukul could have easily left them out. He didn't have to, because we know the kind of literature, archive, periodical, magazines, letters he was looking at. But I think this sense of accountability and responsibility of an intellectual, as Edward Said would say, comes out so truly and beautifully when you look at the references. So when you read the book, please keep two book flaps, one on the page that you're reading, one on the references. Don't read that references without the text or without the page. Also, I think Agay had a long life. I mean, 76 years, three quarters of a century, and a life of a man who was very restless, who as if wanted to actually make sense of all the messiness around and wanted to turn it into a creative literary understanding of the society and the people that he was interacting with. So I think he took a lot upon himself. Otherwise, you don't find a person who's so prolific a writer in so many genres. I mean, which genre did he not touch upon? Generally, I mean, in all literature, whether it is Hindi or Bengali or any other literature, you see people are identified as being novelists or journalists or poet or, but here is a man who's actually writing and going beyond the genre. So something one should make sense of it. Um, Also, as you said, the person who had many shades of life. So the question that comes to my mind is, were all these different shades, different facets of life, were equally revered, equally habitated, equally lived through, or was he compensating by living one shade of life more than other? I mean, how do you make sense of these variegated forms of life with a certain degree of equanimity? It is very difficult. We all have different shades of life, but the way Adye comes out in Nuku's book is sometimes terrifying. That how could somebody have such a kind of life, such a colorful, completely living with inner self, outer self, but beautifully crafted by Mukul, a social history of the time you see in this remarkable biography. Um, I don't want to say much about his experiment with the, Prayogvad, Nahi Kavita, much has been said, written. Already, I think this book is so widely reviewed, and there's so many videos available. You should go and watch some of them. But the thing that really sort of touched me was the way in which ruptures and disjunctures are created, and the literary anxieties and functions and animosities with them. So you don't have to follow a set trajectory, as if, we always think that life has to move in a certain direction. Your parents must be telling you, we also tell you as teacher, do this, now write a proposal, now defend a proposal, then CSR will give you confirmation, then go to the field, then finish your PhD, and you'll get a job, get married, have children, and so on and so forth. But reading about a gay actually disturbs you, or actually disorients you, or tells you life can be actually lived in very different and distinctive ways, and there's no one dominant way in which you should live. I think that comes up very poetically and very beautifully. I don't think Akshay is intending, Akshay is intending to do so, but it's going through the biography, and also I would like to say the chapterization. And it's a social science term, chapterization you use, but I think you probably, I shouldn't call it chapterization, but the different heads of the sections of the book, they themselves speak the real message in those sections. I would also say that Agge is elusive. He's elitist, he's a bit arrogant, unlike people like Mukti Bobod and Mathishan Gupta and many others who are seen as being, more pro people or more humble. And the awards have come in his way because of his being literary genius, no doubt about it. But he, as I said, he seems like a restless soul. Um, and this restless soul has to find answers sometimes in a very strange way, like both of you have said about his relationships with women. Um, and also, I think there is a section in the book which talks about the state and how a gay, and I think it came in Supri's question, in the later years of a gay's life and his proclivity towards the Hindutva, um, at a time when this India has got independence and everybody is looking up to the state as an institution, benevolent institution, a protector of civic life. So he is certainly very, very, very eager to participate in the state institutions. But right in the beginning, I think it's remarkable, it's very brave on his part to guard you that the state institutions should not patronize the art and culture and literature to an extent that the reward are given based on certain kind of selection criteria. So I think which was very foresighted on his part. What we see is happening so robustly these days, and I think I gave could warn us at that time. Uh, he was a great networker globally. I mean, wherever he went, he made friends or he rejuvenated his old friendships. This is remarkable. And also, as both of you said, like he has a personality that people are attracted and drawn towards him. So obviously, he must be a great conversationalist. So reading this book, sometimes I was thinking, well, you are doing a great job for the posterity because we will not have many people in the few years to come who would be alive to even talk about him. I mean, you have created and gave for us as a living being through his writings. He himself left so much and then was such a meticulous keeper of records, as if he knew that you were going to write a biography. So, in some ways, so this idea of a networker is very important, but for fruitful literary purposes. I was intrigued by his views on the mother tongue. I think that Krisha already said. On the one hand, he thinks that mother tongue, or in this case, any language that you feel comfortable. In his case, of course, he knew many languages. He was taught at home, but he still, as you said that he dreams in English. So this constant anxiety, as Alok Rai calls it, anxiety of Hindustani, actually affected large number of writers at that time. Hindi speakers, Hindi writers, or non-Hindi writers. They were good at English, they were good in many other languages, but there was a sense of apology, as if, that if you sort of promote and say that you must learn or teach in Hindi, you are actually depriving the cosmopolitan, the more global language that is English. So I think that also got woven into the narrative of the nation, the idea of nationness that came. This is a huge controversial subject that I'm sure Agir has written much more about it elsewhere or in this book. Um, Also, it has been said how his relationship with his contemporaries. I think much to learn that you made friends and foes in your long journey. And I actually liked it. It's so honestly depicted. There was, I mean, that's the credit goes to Mukul that he did not hide these facts from us, and as Supri said, did not elevate a gay to this sainthoodness, but actually immortal, a normal person who was maybe desperate and restless, but created all kinds of friendship, but also spoiled those friendships because sometimes because of his own making. A liberal thinker, I would say, the first liberal thinker in Hindi literature. And so it's the book is not just a biography, I would say. It's a chronicle of the 20th century India or 20th century Hindi language and literature. I mean, you will not find any other book summing up the trajectory of the Hindi language literature and North India, possibly. So it's a social, I would say, it's a political, it's a cultural, it's a literary text. And the beauty is that all of these have been assembled and put together so freely and so accessibly that you don't have to really scratch your head like we do in social science and reading a work on cultural history of India and you are trying to understand. The book actually puts them together without, I think, making any conscious effort. But as a social scientist, as Supriya was telling, if you read the book through this sort of lens, you will see all these different angles coming together, which is the beauty of this book. A very objective biographer, I would say. Nowhere I could see a certain kind of personal preferences being woven into the text. So the text and the context, as if naturally come together in the book. You read the text, you also understand the context within the text. Neatly interspersed, but he also maintains a certain kind of ethical justice from the subject. So this dichotomy between the subject and object, in an anthropological sense, he's an observer, but he is also looking at the field that he has created. So I think Mukul has done a fantastic job in that. He brings a kind of poetic justice into his text, which when you read it, you will understand what I'm talking about. I was thinking of another biography that was written a few years ago, Amar Singh's diary in Rajasthan. Their Rudolphs, my own teachers, they spent 40 decades, 40 years of their life looking at each and every single paper of Amar Singh, this royal inheritor, and what all he did and his relationship with the closing state and so on and so forth. And the term that Lord Rudolph used was self as other. So when the subject himself starts looking at his own life as an object. And I think in case of Agni, I don't know whether you found that kind of a feeling while going through his paper, that he was looking at himself sometimes objectively and creating the idea of self as other. So I have few questions, not very difficult, but as I would say, framing those questions from the social science perspective on behalf of my students here. Um, how do we bring this kind of a genre and into the social science thinking, writing? And if we bring, what does it do? Does it disinherit us from certain preordained, pre-theoretical idea of concepts and categories that we are so drawn and used to and sort of cultivated within? So my first question is, um, how are you mingling all these different facets of Agni's life um, as writer, rebel, lover, soldier? Is one of them over-determining the other, or should we read all of them with a certain degree of equanimity? Because certainly it becomes difficult to give the equal credit to each one of these facets of his life. So, as a methodological question, how would you do it? I mean, would you have certain pre-theoretical judgment, certain conceptual preferences that you will fit these different um, facets of his life into, through certain events or certain life experience of his? A simple question, but I think I'm asking it from a slightly methodological viewpoint. Um, Second is, he was also someone on whom so much was written, and he left so much behind himself. So a lot of writings, but you rightly said some of those writings were not shared with you. Kapilavatsyan did not, or and the other writer. So people like Pareshwanath and Nimi Jain and so on and so forth. So it must have been a daunting task as a historian, as a journalist, to go through these 20 trunks of his private papers, two big almirahs and numerous archives in India and abroad. But how did you sift through them? In the sense, when you are reading these papers as archives, did you already decide that certain things you will gloss over and you will only take note of certain things? I mean, or did you read all of them with equal patience and with equal attention? It's not possible. For example, when you go to British India Library, they ask you to use pencil those days. And you could only note down few things. Even if you think everything is important in that document, you possibly cannot do it humanly. So, in your uh, experience as reading the archives, how did you read? Did you keep most of the things in your mind? Did you remember, or did you note down? So that's where I think the idea of exclusion and inclusion. Which one would you focus more, and why would you leave out something which might actually be more interesting for readers? So this is simply just a methodological or reading the archives, literary archives, which were very different from historical archives. Um, so that's the second thought that came to my mind. That was there a certain kind of a predetermination that a predetermined lens that you had through which you were looking at these archives. Um, because it's also biography which gives a very loving and humanistic portrayal of Algate. The criticism of Algate emerges on its own in the text. As a reader, you are not being told, but you will discover it. But it's also as if Mukul wants to tell us that Agay has not been treated fairly in the literary world, and these are the ways in which Agay stands out much ahead of others. A colossal subject, a colossal biography, I would say, which actually, in 600 pages does enormous amount of work. Um, so another thing which I think, I guess you have told us, which I think is very important for us to keep in mind, you particularly students and those of us who are in the academy, I guess say somewhere in Mukul's book only that you should maintain a separation or a distance between academic scholarship and literary writings. And I think that becomes that justifies as to sometimes you cannot say the kind of things you would like to say in academic writings, but you can say possibly in literary writings. So I think this distinction is important for us to keep in mind because otherwise, the time we are living in, everything can be seen, controversial. Um, Thirdly, and I think a genre that I think emerges for us social scientists from this book is what I would like to call a literary ethnography. We do all sorts of ethnography. Ethnography is anthropologists do a certain way in which they conduct ethnographies, and we have had ethnography on partition, for example, on displaced human persons, or more so recently on the CA protest, anti-CA protest. So this idea of literary ethnography that I think seems to emerge in this book is also a cultural ethnography. Because it's as much about the world of art and culture, which is very sublime, which cannot be actually categorized, classified like the census, like the caste, or like the religion. Categories that we feel very comfortable dealing with. But literature actually is very different. So this literary ethnography as a mode of orientation or as a methodology brings certain insights from the field that is observed by the ethnographer, and here being Mukul, upon the subject himself, and the subject is then invoked in a certain way and brought back into the text or brought back into the ethnography itself. So the subject becomes both an object and the subject. So I think that's the beauty I would see in this. He doesn't call it literary ethnography, but I think if you really want to maybe understand the way in which he is doing this very difficult, very arduous task. I mean, 5 years of labor of love into this book. This is what emerges. So there is it's really a litmus test for the writer. Um, and I would say that social science students have much to learn from a book like this, because it tells you how to use archives, how to not use archives, which one to select, which one to use, which one to abandon. Not all archives will be required for your work, but you have to bear a very careful lens of an observer, of a writer, if you are doing the archives. And now, I mean, the 200 pages of notes and the bibliographies, secondary works, primary work, newspapers, periodicals, diaries, private papers, editorials, translation in Hindi and other languages. I mean, it's enormous. And I think the takeaway from this book for us here in this room is that we do the social science research, we should be mindful of this kind of literature which exists in abundance. Why are we only going to the field as we were saying, with a certain kind of macro understanding or a very rational understanding? We do number crunching, we do quantitative work, we do qualitative work, we use all kinds of hermeneutical, normative, conceptual frameworks. But we don't look at the literature, which actually can bring sometimes very important insights. So I think today, I think that message must go clearly to you. And an important facet along with this is the power of words and power of languages, which I think we tend to overlook because we are hegemonized in our thinking in one language or at the most two languages, even though we are all plurilingual, or possibly most of us are multilingual. Society is multilingual, but we sort of compress that multilinguality in one language, which we right, and that actually also compresses our thought process. So we should be careful about it, and it shows that you don't have to do it. You can be easily conversant with many languages, or as Gramsci would say, every language is part of thought structure, right? So how do we, and I think Mukul's book is actually telling you repeatedly the heterogeneity of the social, and please do not neglect it. Do not use a very rigid way of understanding. Um, and this heterogeneity is the soul of our democratic institutions, of our democratic culture. Something that we should be more careful, because we are living in times, and I have no hesitation in saying it, that every day you are watching in front of you that institutions are being destroyed, or the democratic ethos and culture of these institutions is being compromised. We are made to believe in a certain kind of hyper nationalism or surrealism of a certain kind. But if you pay attention to, I would say, this kind of literary sensibility, which still exists, who knows, we might even lose it. The other day there was a news in the newspaper. I mean, you read about how our CHS library. Uh, so the news was that the library as a subject, which was in the state, which is a state subject, now it is being amended and being made as concurrent subject. The idea is that there's so many, I think 7,000 or 17,000 public libraries in this country. The idea is to get rid of some of those libraries, which means also some of the private collections. Rather than saving them for posterity, we are actually destroying them. So, and another thing which I would like to just share after reading from this whole idea of Vatsalnidhi that he set up with his Ganpid award money of 1 lakh and supplemented with his own money, is rare. Generally, writers or all kinds of writers, they collect the money and they don't think of doing any return of it. But here is a man who wants to set up the trust and who hasn't made any of his family members as part of the trust. But the trust is actually to encourage the younger generation for the posterity, reward them, or people who are in need. And I think this is something remarkable to learn from his life. All of us can, you know, do something like that, if not at that scale, but certainly at a smaller scale. So I would say he lived a life, absolutely fabulous life of a writer, life of a lover, life of a rebel, life of a soldier, and life of journalist, so on and so forth, which bequeathed it, or which left such a huge treasure of knowledge for us that Mukul's book has actually opened the floodgate to look at not simply the life of this remarkable literature, human being or writer, but also to weave different stories, and maybe reading a day you will get more attracted towards doing a biography of Matthew or somebody else. I think that's something that comes out very innovatively, very creatively, and pedagogically absolutely baffling that how different writers of that age come together as if they wanted to create an India of the kind. And these were such interesting, challenging, I think, years that they could, they were lucky to be have born in that time and to have worked for us. That's why we have what we have today. So my plea to all of you as students from this, or the key from this book, I would like to insist upon that please be optimistic. I know sometimes it is disheartened, and think of doing something, whether through your PhD or through the papers that you write, is for posterity, not just for yourself. And let the future generation also have the right to write about you. Thank you.
Open it for audience. So, there are any questions or queries? Okay, so the author. No. Keep the book.